Let us now look at the Fitch rating reports. So the Fitch rating report says there's a correlation between the Sri Lankan domestic bank's assets related to its lending or investments and the sovereign debt rating of the Sri Lanka government based on the Fitch rating, which is CCC, and long-term local currency issuer default rating, and also accordingly they say CCC negative. So they correlate the Sri Lankan commercial banks assets into the sovereign rating given to the Sri Lanka government. This issue came up because in the Sri Lanka Parliament, Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe on his first maiden speech highlighted that Sri Lanka government depends on borrowing from the commercial banking sector in urgent situations. So now after that speech only, the Fitch ratings have found this correlation between the Sri Lankan commercial banks assets to the Sri Lanka government ratings. Sri Lanka government ratings were like CCC negative for a certain time, but after the Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe's speech that exposed the Sri Lanka government dependence on the commercial banks in urgent times to borrow through the commercial banks, its foreign currency requirements have led to this report of the Fitch rating issued on July 1st after Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe's speech in the parliament. Of course, they have found this sudden so-called correlation which we cannot accept. How come the Fitch ratings waited such a long time to correlate Sri Lanka's commercial banking portfolio's asset portfolio as CCC negative or as CCC long-term local currency issuer defaulter ratings to the Sri Lanka government CCC negative and long-term long-term local currency issuer default rating is political, because it's only after Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe's speech in the parliament, the Fitch rating immediately said that they cannot issue Sri Lanka commercial banks in any rating above the CCC negative. Now that is a political maneuvering by the Fitch rating, which we deny, reject, right? So based on this, what this Fitch rating says is like they say that for also they highlight certain so-called information that they suddenly got after Mr. Ranil Wickremesinghe's speech to say that the Sri Lanka's banks the tier 1 ratio or common equity standard ratio, tier 1 ratio had dropped 18 to 219 basis points by end of 2020. So what is this tier 1? Let us look at it. Tier 1 is like an international standard for central banks around the world by BCBS in Switzerland that requires central banks around the country to require the commercial banks in their country to maintain minimum capital requirements. So this minimum capital requirement, according to 1988 BCBS Accord of the group, of Group 10 countries in 1992, they have set the benchmark standards like tier 1 and tier 2. So capital, when we look at capital tier 1, like it's like a this standard with they have calculated through this mechanism of in 1992 the BCBS Switzerland. It's like to maintain a certain like a minimum capital requirements, because in case of insolvency of a bank, commercial bank, it's the capital of the commercial bank that can be realized to settle the payments of the the customers. That is why the minimum capital standard of the capital request to equity of the shareholders. So that will be always there to support the any payments due to the depositors in case of default of any commercial bank in the world. That's why these standards are set. So tier 1 according to these BCBS agreements means like how it is calculated is like this. Now that say for example a financial institution, banks has total assets total assets means its lending portfolio credit given by the commercial banks as a certain amount, say 100 billion Sri Lankan US dollars, then suppose the total assets are to say 100 billion, and say it's so to say the what happens is here the total assets are calculated, and thereafter the risk asset value is calculated. Right, say the risk weighted assets value, say for example is 1.2 trillion, then to calculate the tier 1 capital ratio, the 200 billion is divided by 1.2 trillion. So to give a capital ratio, then when you divide 200 billion by 200 billion, 1.2 trillion means 1200 billion. So then 200 billion divided by 1200 billion, well, divide it, it's about 16.66%. So the tier 1, there are certain standards by the central bank. So here it's 16.66 in this example. Normally it's all right. It's above the standard. I think the standards vary, but normally the standards are around 9.5 to 10 to 12%. So as long as Sri Lanka keeps those standards, there's no risk according to the ratings. But here now let's look at this rating here, calculation of the tier 1. Now the tier 1 actually look at the the first the total tier 1 assets, right? Total tier 1 assets or the lending portfolio, the credit portfolio of a commercial bank, which I said 200 billion. So then, and the risk-weighted assets are like 1.2 trillion, total risk-weighted assets. 1.2 trillion. So then 1.2 trillion means 1,200 billion, and then the total tier 1 assets are 200 billion. So 1,200 billion rather divided by 200. It gives this how this ratio, how this definition is calculated. Let's look at what's the tier 1 for this calculation, say how the risk weighted assets are calculated. Now say for example, when you have say 200 billion divided by 1,200, then you get about you get about into 100 you get 16.66. So then when you look at the risk weighted assets, it's actually to the assets or the loan. Assets means the loans of a commercial bank. So the loans can be given in different, now for example Sri Lankan commercial bank can have invested in another government, Australian government securities and housing loans, business loan, personal loans, etc. So according to these the loans, there is a certain risk to these loans. Now for example housing loans, the calculated risk can be say it's calculated say about 35%. Say business loans, it can be 100% risk of not recovery. There's a risk of not recovering. But when it comes to Sri Lankan commercial bank, suppose it invested in another country's government securities, say the Sri Lanka commercial banks invested in Australian government's government bonds, then the risk weight is zero, because they will be repaid since it's Australian government asset. Definitely Sri Lanka government can recover, Sri Lankan commercial banks can recover. But when it comes to housing loans also, since there is a land as a mortgage, the risk is about 35% low. But when it comes to business loans, it's about 100% risk. So then what the risk-weighted assets are calculated by multiplying the amount of the lending portfolio of the commercial bank, say housing loans 100 billion and the total housing loans of a commercial bank, and then the risk assigned is 35% into 100 billion into 35%, like that. So that gives the risk risk-weighted asset calculation, right? And suppose the Australian government bond Sri Lanka commercial bank, one of the Sri Lankan commercial banks like Sampath Bank invested, suppose it's 200 billion rupees, then the risk is zero because it's Australian government bond, they will definitely pay. Therefore, the risk-weighted assets are zero there because there is no risk to that asset. But housing business loans, say they have given 500 billion rupees business loans by Sampath Bank, there is a 100% risk for business loan recovery, normal standard in banking practice. So the risk-weighted asset will be 100 billion calculation. So that is how the risk-weighted assets are normally calculated, and accordingly the tier 1 calculation is done. Let me explain that in the next video.